slides here. Something like a Zoom moment. There you go. Okay, so you should be able to see my slides. So hi everybody, I'm Shana O'Connell. And I'm actually in interdisciplinary studies, but I do classics at Howard University. So still considered a classicist. And I am an archaeologist by training, and also I'm basically a classical archaeologist. I got my PhD from Johns Hopkins in 2015, and then I started teaching at Howard University that fall. So Howard has been my academic home for almost a decade now. And I teach classes in mythology, and then the class that I'm going to be as part of my presentation today is my classical art class, and this is sort of closest to my training as an archaeologist. I'd also like to thank Anika for organizing, and Gary. I'm excited for the Plato conference. I should be able to attend. I think that sounds just absolutely excellent. So really excited to talk to you all today. And my presentations today and then in May, I wanted to focus on how to use museum resources in the classroom, particularly to integrate like diverse depictions from antiquity, from lack of a better word. But I'm focusing on Frank Snowden's work, which is Blacks in Antiquity. So like that's going to be the main frame of my presentation. But the main point of it is that in our teaching, there's so much more that museums have visually than gets into the textbooks. And so the best way to use material culture in your classroom or to encourage students, to actually see ancient artworks is to send them to the museum websites and actually have them sort of click around. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about Snowden and how I use his work in teaching my classical art course. So the course is is a chronological introduction to the classical artistic style. And I use Snowden to integrate depictions of Black people into that conversation, and also to make it more obvious that antiquity and the stories that we should tell about it are more complicated than what you might see if you open up a single textbook. So I wanted to go ahead and introduce Snowden, and also yeah, okay. So speaking of stories, as I was doing the research for this presentation, one of the blogs that I was looking at was talking about Snowden as a teacher, had this quote from Terence, and it is, "I am human and I consider nothing human to be alien to me." So that was kind of a centering quote as I was preparing this presentation. So Frank M. Snowden Jr. was an African-American man born in 1911 in York County, VA. As I was preparing to this, I got very interested in his bibliography and his biography. So I'm just hitting the highlights here. He moved to Boston as a kid and went to Boston Latin School. And then he did all of his postgraduate work at Harvard in classics. And he was an eminent classicist, incredibly accomplished, started teaching at Howard University in Washington, D.C., which is a historically Black university, a few years before finishing his PhD. And then he was a Fulbright scholar in Italy. He was a cultural attaché to Italy. And in 2003, he was a recipient of the National Humanities Award. He's also, to my mind, still the best resource if you want to look for art that depicts Black people in ancient Greek and Roman art. There's been, new work on the topic that's really great, and I can talk about that. But especially for a classroom context, if you're looking for a range of depictions and a scholarly approach, Snowden is still the place to go. So a couple of photos of Snowden from his career. The last one is the Medal of Honor, National Humanities Award from 2003. And then the main book that I recommend for teaching is actually Blacks in Antiquity from 1970. But I'm traveling as I'm presenting this, so I only brought the Before Color Prejudice work, which is a little lighter. But either one of those books is good to teach from, and will give you a nice overview as well as images to look for. And then the last image here is a letter that he wrote to W.E.B. Du Bois. Um, okay, so when I'm using Snowden's work, and I feel like I should say too with this, you know, teaching at Howard has completely changed my perspective on the work that I do in the best possible way, in the sense that, I've always taught from the perspective that as historians and as an archaeologist, I'm looking for the truth of antiquity, and also, trying to teach that in the best way possible. And so, think of these images as a way to get closer to the truth of antiquity. So, the truth of, who was there, who was making art, what did the art actually look like, what is its cultural context. And so Snowden is still indispensable for this. I should also say though, with Before Color Prejudice, so this one came out in 1991. So the thrust of his work too was that racism, particularly what we think of as like anti-Black racism today, did not exist in antiquity, and that is correct. Although in recent years, people have pointed out to there are forms of prejudice where some of the images aren't necessarily flattering. So it's a bit more complicated. So sometimes Snowden was critiqued for having kind of a utopian ideal, which I'm not totally sure is fair to Snowden. I think he was, yeah, I'm not sure that he was quite arguing for some sort of ideal in antiquity, but more so that like any projection of like racism onto these past images is really a projection and not something that emerges from the images themselves or from the ancient culture. So I try to convey that in my classical art class. And again, the way that I try to do this is through integrating into our study of the chronological procession of art, works of art from Snowden, so depictions of Black people in ancient Egypt and Greece and Rome. So the way that I do it is just to, open up the book and look for images from a period that I might be talking about, which is what I would recommend if you want to use them for teaching. So in my class too, I start with ancient Egypt, and this is part of the history of archaeology. It's a natural approach, but it also allows me to start, talking about imagery at a point in time where you have the development of a civilization, the development of writing, the development of kingship, and so forth, and also to talk about something that came out of the first conference, which someone had a quote like that Black people were always there. And that really hit me because that's the way that I want to teach it in my class, that when we go back to ancient Egypt, Black people were always there. And here's the imagery that shows you this. So movies or representations that sort of obscure that, are incorrect. And the other part of this too in my teaching that it was also acknowledged in the history. So like I'm showing you the pharaoh Narmer. So some of the earliest British archaeologists identified the earliest pharaohs as Black. They use different terms, of course, but they also saw them as looking more African. It's another term that they used. So like this is a depiction of Narmer. And so I introduced this particular depiction in my class this year. And one of the ways that I framed it in class, because I like to kind of keep it open to the students to make that identification for themselves. But the way I framed it was that this particular portrait of Narmer, if it is in fact Narmer, was identified by this archaeologist, Flinders Petrie, as Narmer because the portrait looks Black. And he identified the early pharaohs that way. So that's how I introduced this particular portrait. So there's a view of it in the museum on the slide, and then on the right, a seated statue of Zoser from the same period. So if you're using Frank Snowden, he also starts with ancient Egypt, and I want to do something kind of interactive in May where I will maybe lead you through going to the museum websites, and something that'll be a little more free form than what I'm doing. But like, for example, the most of the museums, or not most of the museums, many of the museums have really great online resources now. So like if you open up Snowden or actually any other text, that scholarly text with imagery, it should have a resource that points to the collection that the image is in. So like here, I have linked to the British Museum website on this statue of Tarhaka. Which I can follow. So as we're going through the periods of art, and I'm using Frank Snowden this way, but I also have students do activities where they'll describe the work of art in its chronological context. So like, why does the style look the way it does for that particular period? And in fact, as I was teaching at Howard and then looking into Black's antiquity, I ended up teaching or have been teaching a period in more detail, in part because it allows for more of this kind of conversation and sort of imagery. And that period is the 7th century BCE. So at the top image here, it's a little ivory from that period. Um, and the next slide, I have another ivory from the period on the far left. So one of the things that I have students do is I'll give them a range of ivories, so not just these two, but all different sort of kinds of imagery. And then I'll have them do a close visual description and their own kind of research on it, and contextualize it in the history of art that we're talking about. So like the image up top is a man being attacked by a lion, and it's actually gold studded. It's a very fancy image made in Western Asia and antiquity, um, and today at the British Museum. So this is a common theme in ancient art of a lion attack, sort of like a battle scene. So you have a comparative image on the bottom from the Archaic period. And then checking my time. Okay. Off to the left, same sort of period. You have a man with an oryx and a monkey. So this is a trader or someone, sort of a diplomat, depiction of a diplomat. Um, One of the things that came out of my presentation in May, and which I've not necessarily been successful at getting students to talk about, and in part because maybe I myself am not totally comfortable or haven't sort of figured it out. But one of the things that came out is that museums today aren't really sure what sort of language to use for ancient art. So, like this particular image in class, we would talk about him in terms of depictions of Nubian people in Egyptian art. And there's good scholarly reasons too for this attribution. And yet on the museum website, it just describes him as a man with an oryx and a monkey. So, which is perhaps good because it's not sort of separating him out. But at the same time, I think you sort of lose the cultural connections there. I hope that's sort of clear. But for reference too, so this little ivory was made in Western Asia, but it's inspired by an Egyptian model. And we do look at these paintings in class. These are also in Snowden. They depict, in the middle, you have princes from Nubia, and then the bottom right, traders coming, well, actually not so much traders, but men coming in with tribute that they're bringing to the Egyptian pharaoh. So you can see that the sort of connection to the sky as tribute bearer. But again, what I try to do in class is let the students come up with these attributions too, especially because I think the museum websites are not always good at that. Okay, so I want to finish out my examples with some portraiture, um, which I almost never get to in my classical art class. I usually have so much to talk about from ancient Egypt and early Greece that I think I need to write up a second class where we focus more on later Greece and Rome. But I did want to show the portraits with you because there's a fabulous tradition of portraiture. Um, And these are also, this particular portrait I found first in Snowden. And this is in the Berkeley Museum today. Again, this one online is described as a man with curly hair. Um, and then the discussion online goes into talking about Egyptian art. It's okay. But I think it might sort of lose the connection to Black history, to Snowden. Although again, I'm sort of open to how others might see that too. But in my classes, so part of the context that we would talk about is the sort of coming out of Snowden and Black representation in antiquity. But also this particular portrait, it's a great example of several features that are common in Roman portraiture. One is the use of gray or black marble. Um, so if you have the chance to go to a museum, say in Italy, the Vatican museums, you'll see a wide array of sculptures, even I think more than you could ever sort of get in a textbook. And so one of the things you'll find is a range of materials beyond white marble. You also find multicolor marble or black and gray marble like you see here. So the figure on the left is also from Snowden. So this is from the National Museum in Rome. And then just I have a couple of comparative images on the right with similar types of marble. A feature which I'm probably not going to have too much time to talk about in May necessarily, but just want to gesture to in this or now in this presentation is polychromy. So ancient Greek sculpture was also painted. So we do talk about that a little bit in my classes too, and try to see the original context of ancient art in some more detail. So again, sort of if I was to focus on this portrait, one of the first things I might talk about too is the use of the gray marble. Another feature that I would talk about places it in the larger chronological and archaeological history is the figure's turning head. So seems like a very subtle thing to us today. We might be very used to seeing a depiction of a person with their head sort of slightly turned. But this originates around the time of Alexander, and it comes from a particular Hellenistic tradition. So, and it's probably why the museum also identified the head on the far left as being made in Turkey, because this was one of the centers of production. And also on the left, is a portrait from Berlin, also from Snowden. I will say one of the challenges of using Black's antiquity for teaching, and if anyone does use it in their teaching and ever wants assistance, please let me know, is that some of the museums don't have as good online collections, and so sometimes the only image you might have is from Black's antiquity, which I think might mean that there needs to be a new book or some industrious teacher should write a grant to go travel and take more photos. But anyway, so just throwing that out there if you are looking for images. Certainly they're well cited, but again, the online resources might not always be there. And finally, you want to end with a portrait that is from Snowden, which I talked about a little bit in May, and I think does a nice connection back to Narmer at the beginning, because this particular identification of the portrait is based on the perception of Blackness of the figure, or the depiction of a Black person or a Black man. So at the beginning of my presentation, I talked about Narmer, little Narmer portrait. There's no inscription identifying him, so it's really based on his physical appearance and his Blackness that he's identified as Narmer. So it's the same with this portrait. So there are literary sources that identify a student of Herodes Atticus named Memnon. So Memnon is also the name of the Ethiopian hero from Homer. And he's an important part of Blacks in antiquity. So, um, you know, Snowden talks about how when Ethiopians are mentioned, particularly in Greek and Roman sources, usually they're talking about someone who's Black. Um, so there was a historical Memnon from Ethiopia who was a student of Herodes Atticus, which also raises interesting questions about how he came about his name and just yeah. But anyway, so this particular portrait was found at the villa of Herodes Atticus. This is a photo of the villa, and it's identified as Memnon, the student. And then at the site, there was also an inscription that identifies the name Memnon too. So we have several types of evidence. You have literary evidence that mentions Memnon as a student in the textual sources. You have archaeological evidence with this particular portrait that then we look and examine, and then you have the epigraphic evidence, which is the name of Memnon to come together and identify this man. And then finally, for the stylistic analysis, it's also an excellent Antonine period portrait. So one of the features of the Antonine period of portraiture is their eyes are always sort of looking off and away in this really interesting um, feature. So you have a couple of examples on the right as well. So all of these examples that I've tried to show you here are dovetailing with Snowden's work and how I try to integrate it into my teaching. Oh, I had a couple more actually. Sorry, women and children. Really quick. I'm bad feminist here. So at the left, this is actually a good example of a portrait that unfortunately I have not been able to find better photos of than what you have in Snowden. So it's at the left. It's from the Athenian Agora. So it shows a woman, a Black woman, um, with a particular hairstyle that identifies her with the Trajanic period. So the ones off to the right also have Trajanic hairstyles. And then last one, so this little girl was also in Snowden. So, okay. So like I said, what I've tried to present here is a little bit of how I incorporate Black antiquity into my teaching. And I feel like it's successful, but also I have to say, I've had particularly this semester has been a bit challenging. So I'm very excited to meet with you all and talk to you all, especially because I've just found myself to be a little getting close to burnout with teaching and um, uh, yeah, not anything terrible, but just I feel like I'm looking forward to your questions and what you have to say as a way of kind of catching the enthusiasm back. Sometimes um, I wonder if it's how meaningful it is sometimes. But anyway, I think I will leave it there. And I did include a couple of blog posts that I find helpful, really in introducing students to the topic. So Sarah Derbeau is a scholar who she has a recent book called Untangling Blackness in Classical Antiquity. It gets more theoretical than you might have for teaching. However, I do recommend it. But if you're looking for images, I think Snowden is still sort of the basis. But I put two blog posts by her on here that I think do a really excellent job too of kind of summarizing um, where we've come in classics since then, and also reiterating that what I think of as the main contribution of Snowden, which is Blackness in antiquity was much more complicated, and also that any ideas about slavery and Blackness that have come from like more recent history, like that did not exist in antiquity. So Derbo's blog posts, I've assigned them to students a few times, and I find them really nice for a summary. And then the last blog post is a praise of Frank Snowden, also online. So I thought it was a nice summary. So I just wanted to share those with you. And I also want to throw out again, please don't hesitate to contact me if I can help you with your teaching of archaeological materials or answering questions. So thank you all for your attention. And thank you, Anika, again for inviting me.
Thank you. And you have like 9 minutes for Q&A. The next
Okay.
person to, yeah. So, and also, could you add the links, the further reading links in the chat? I'll add them
Yeah,
to the website as well. But feel free
will do.
take some questions and answers. We have a few minutes.
Yeah.